and welcome to this edition of your Energy Frontiers for the week. I am Justina Okechukwu. Let's begin the package with the headline energy news. Equinor, a Norwegian energy firm, has announced plans to sell off its 20.2% stake worth $1 billion in the offshore Agbami oil field located in Nigeria. The move places Equinor alongside other Western oil firms, including ExxonMobil, Shell, and Total Energies, who are seeking to sell off assets in Nigeria as they focus on newer and more profitable operations. South Africa's energy giant Sasol has announced the signing of 3 power purchase agreements for the supply of renewable power as part of plans to reduce its carbon emissions by at least 30% by the year 2030. Sasol, in separate statements, said it had partnered with industrial gases company Air Liquide for 2 PPAs with Enel Green Power for the supply of renewable energy to its Secunda operations, and another 69 megawatts deal with Musinge and Moyeni Wind Farm for its Sasolburg units. Tullow Oil says the company is in talks with the Ghanaian government over a $300 million tax bill imposed by the Revenue Authority for its operations in 2023. The oil producer says it plans to invest $400 million this year, mainly on its flagship fields in Ghana, Gabon, Cote d'Ivoire, and Kenya, with free cash flow expected to be about $200 million in the current year. The African Energy Chamber on Thursday hosted both African and European stakeholders for the Invest in African Energy reception at the Waldorf Hotel in London. The high-profile event had in attendance African energy ministers, including Equatorial Guinea's Gabriel Mbanga Obiang-Lima and Nigeria's Timi Pre-Silva. The attendees also include high-level government representatives, including Fode Mansare from Sierra Leone and James Mnukwe from Namibia, among other top speakers. The reception was aimed at connecting stakeholders with financiers to drive new deals and investment across current and upcoming project developments in Africa. And that was a snapshot of your energy news headlines. When we return, Uganda hits the ground running with its first historic oil drilling. More on this in just a moment. Welcome back to the program. Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni on Tuesday cut the ribbon to launch the country's first oil drilling program at the Chinese-operated Kingfisher oil field near the Lake Albert area in Kukube district. According to Ernest Rubundo, Executive Director of Uganda's Petroleum Authority, Kingfisher field is part of a $10 billion scheme to develop its oil reserves and build a vast pipeline to ship the crude to international markets via an Indian Ocean port. Listen here.
The Kingfisher oil field is estimated to have a total of 560 million barrels of oil in place. Out of these, 190 million barrels of oil, which is about 33%, is expected to be produced over a period of 20 to 25 years. This oil field is expected to have a maximum production of 40,000 barrels of oil per day for 5 years. After that 5 years, the production of this oil field will begin to decline, so you'll have less oil produced. The field development plan, which the Honorable Minister of Energy and Mineral Development has approved, provides that when production at this oil field begins to decline, the company will start producing from the 3 oil fields of Waraga, Mputa, and Nzizi, which are in the Kaiso-Tonya area, 40 kilometers north of here. Production from these 3 oil fields will enable to maintain the production of the Kingfisher project, and the oil produced from those 3 oil fields in the Kaiso-Tonya area will be transported by pipeline to a processing facility that is going to be located here.
Your Excellency, I will use this opportunity to mention the progress of the East African crude oil pipeline and the refinery. These are key infrastructure that facilitate what we are witnessing today. The upstream and midstream segments of the oil and gas sector are integrated. And in this regard, significant progress has been made in achieving the aspirations of the commercialization strategy for the crude oil. The legal and commercial framework for the East African crude oil pipeline was concluded with the enactment of the East African crude oil pipeline enabling legislations in both Uganda and in the United Republic of Tanzania. The government and the ECOP Limited have been implementing the Resettlement Action Plan for the right-of-way and above-ground installations. And so far, more than 68% of the project affected persons in these areas have been compensated, while resettlement houses are under construction for the project-affected persons that opted for physical relocation. The ECOP Limited and government have also commenced the livelihood restoration programs for the affected persons along the pipeline corridor. Your Excellency, on this historic day, we are also honored to have you present as we hand over the East African crude oil pipeline license to ECOP Company Limited. I'll be doing this shortly after my speech. The company applied for a license in July 2022 to construct the pipeline. We reviewed the application, found it satisfactory, and subsequently sought approval from Cabinet for the grant of license. And last week, the government approved and issued the license.
That was the grand opening of Uganda's first oil drilling program. After the break, we will examine the operational performance of the Nigerian electricity market. This is Energy Frontiers. Welcome back. I am Justina Okechukwu. Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission recently released its first and second quarter report for 2022. The report outlined the state of Nigerian electricity supply industry, covering the operational and commercial performance, regulatory functions, and consumer affairs. Rumundaka Wanodi is the founder and CEO at ZKJ Energy Partners. He's also the founding CEO of the Nigerian Bulk Electricity Trading PLC or N. So I asked him to unpack the latest NERC report. So what's your take on this Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission report on the state of the sector?
I mean, if you look at it, it's not a very positive trend in all, because you look at the key indices and you can see that when it comes to things like the output, billing efficiency, revenues, it seems that there's been a decline between the first quarter and the second quarter. Some places there's a little gain, when it comes to billing efficiency and things like that. So, in all, for a sector that is struggling, that you expect to see improvements, it's not coming as would be desirable.
Now, for the second quarter, like you said, both the total revenues collected by discos and the amount billed to customers were reduced compared to the first quarter. Any idea what the problem is with this score?
That is a pretty straightforward thing. Revenue is a matter of price times quantity. And if you looked at it, you can see that total generation output dropped, from the first quarter to the second quarter, and that is responsible for that decrease in revenues. The fact that there is a dip of about 6% in generation output, that easily explains that.
Now, when it comes to restructuring, is there a need to restructure the discos, like privatizing them 100% to the private sector?
Well, the question first is, why do you want to privatize, and what is the problem today that we have? The primary problems with the distribution is that there are no new investments coming in. We need capital to build out the disco, improve the network, do mass metering, and look at other things, and have a working capital to pay bills that come in, especially for power supplied by the generation companies, right? So if you look at that, is the issue of capital. That's what everybody talks about, the structure. And then you ask yourself, who can put the capital at this moment? Apparently, the private sector is unable to. The state of the industry and the economy makes it very challenging. So the ones that are already in there are not able to do much. So if there is anything that needs to be restructured in any way, I think that you should find a way for the state, the government, to make immediate investments, and then we can begin to talk about maybe operations and maintenance of the distribution companies. And then when the market is stable, you can try to privatize them. At this moment, I think it's rather challenging. You have investors who have been in this sector, in these assets, having it very difficult to raise additional capital. And the regulatory landscape, I'm not talking about as provided by the sector regulator, but I'm talking about, even the capital markets, the regulation, foreign exchange, and what have you, makes it very challenging to raise capital right now. So privatizing or government trying to sell down its 40%, I don't think is a pathway. Government should be bold, as it had earlier on contemplated, make investments in the distribution companies as shareholder loans, and then with time, it can then decide to sell its shares when the sector is more stable.
You can watch my full interview with Rumundaka Wanodi on our YouTube channel at Frontier Africa Reports. And as we wrap up the package for you this week, we put together a short video of some of the sound bites that focused on global energy industry from the just concluded World Economic Forum held in Davos last week. Remember to follow Energy Frontiers on Frontier Africa Reports website, subscribe to our YouTube, and follow us across all our social media handles as indicated on the screen. Goodbye from me, Justina Okechukwu.
We are flirting with climate disaster. Every week brings a new climate horror story. Greenhouse gas emissions are at record levels and growing. The commitment to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees is nearly going up in smoke. Without further action, we are headed to a 2.8 degree increase, and the consequences, as we all know, would be devastating. Several parts of our planet would be uninhabitable, and for many, it will mean a death sentence. But this is not a surprise. The science has been clear for decades. And I'm not talking only about UN scientists. I'm talking even about fossil fuel scientists. We learned last week that certain fossil fuel producers were fully aware in the 70s that their core product was making our planet. And just like the tobacco industry, they rode roughshod over their own science. Some in big oil peddled the big lie. And like the tobacco industry, those responsible must be held to account. Today, fossil fuel producers and their enablers are still racing to expand production, knowing full well that this business model is inconsistent with human survival. So we need to act together to close the emissions gap And that means to phase out progressively coal and supercharge the renewable revolution, to end the addiction to fossil fuels, and to stop our self-defeating war on nature. On the other hand, the developed world must finally deliver on its 100 billion climate finance commitment to support developing countries. Adaptation finance must be doubled, as it was promised in Sharm el-Sheikh. And the biggest emitters, namely the G20 countries, must unite around the Climate Solidarity Pact, in which they make extra efforts in the 2020s to keep the 1.5-degree limit alive.
If we all want to reach a 1.5-degree target to keep our climate safe, what the scientists tell us to do, our climate target. Today, the world invests $1 for fossil fuels and $1.50 for clean energy. So the ratio is $1 for fossil fuels, $1.50 for clean energy. If we want to reach our target, this ratio of 1 to 1.5 should be 1 to 9.
9.
So big increase in clean energy investment, and which makes it even more difficult, the growth of the clean energy investment need to come from the developing countries where cost of capital for clean energy technologies is about 6-7 times higher than US or Europe and elsewhere. I think this is the nerve center of all the problem. How? Because I believe money and the clean energy projects in Europe and in US, IRA, Fit for 55, at the end, they will meet. But what are we going to do in the emerging countries? And I believe advanced economies have two reasons to support the clean energy financing in developing countries. Number one, 1 ton of CO2 going to atmosphere from Detroit or from Jakarta or from New York or from Marseille has the same effect on everybody. Yeah. You can do whatever you want at home. It doesn't change if the emissions come from elsewhere. You can bring the UK emissions, Europe emissions to zero. You will not be able to protect yourself from climate change impacts if Indonesia and other countries go along. So first, on a logical reason. And second, the other driver why they should invest, help clean energy transition in developing countries, is a moral reason. The climate change is an issue of concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, and about 80% of this the carbon in the atmosphere put there by the advanced economies since 100 years. So they have a moral reason to clean it up as well. For two reasons, I believe, would it be World Bank reform, the IFIs, and so on, they have to advance this.
Well, thank you. I mean, this is not an easy question. I always say that the future of trade is services, it's digital, it's green, and it should be inclusive. That's the future of trade. So if the future of trade is green, you can only, you have to, when countries or members take steps to try to see how to decarbonize, to get to net zero by 2050, I think you can only be supportive. All of us are supportive of that objective, and trade should certainly be part of it. I think that the challenge comes with how, and one has to tread very delicately here. Certainly, it's the balance that you talked about. What one does not want is, if we are going back to industrial policy, quote unquote, we should not see a race, a subsidization race. So
are we there today?
Well, we are watching to see if we're there and hoping that that's not really where we are. So how we manage that? It's very important to give incentives to decarbonize, to work with the private sector, as Larry said, research and innovation, to encourage dissemination of technology all around the world, because we're all in this together. So all that is good. So it's a question of, where do the subsidies go? How do they encourage everyone to be part of it? And what's the balance? Because if it's a race, then you know that, of course, emerging markets and developing countries will not be able to compete in such a subsidy race. So I'm hoping that what we're seeing is going to be a balanced and nuanced approach to decarbonizing and not something else.